By the way, Chris is recording this, and he and Tina will be putting it on the website. So the presentations you're hearing, most of the presentations do have papers in the proceedings, so keep that in mind. The next presentation, as we move along in these fundamentals, we want to talk about the next one. Now, Marvin has got us to a point where we've got a good thick stand of whatever species or mixture you wanted in that field. Now it's time to get into the production phase, and remember that our emphasis during this phase is to produce for yield. And we've asked Dr. Scott Flynn to come and cover this particular one. I've known Scott since he was a graduate student at the University of Kentucky. He's gone on in the university setting, and recently, in the last couple of years, he's joined Dow Agri-Sciences, and I'm delighted to have him here to talk about produce for yield.
Thank you, Gary. Gary, if you don't mind, just give me a little signal. Fit time. After about 2.5 hours, give me. Do y'all want to know the definition of nervous? Is to be a guy standing in front of a room full of forage extension agronomists and forage specialists and trying to tell them how to produce for yield. All right? They're going to shoot holes in this the whole way through. I'm probably going to get taken out to the parking lot afterwards. It is a little bit nerve-wracking. I'm especially nervous about Gary sitting up here right up front. But I'm going to try to I can't address how, everyone's issues on how to increase yield. There's no way, no how. So I'm going to kind of give you my perspective on it. Don't shoot me. So producing for yield is the keys to success. I look at producing for yield, I look at a kind of an order of operations. Now I work for Dow Agri-Sciences. You notice the order of operations, I put weed management first. I'm going to prove that, okay? I think about it in terms of weed management, soil fertility, species selection, and grazing management as maximizing yield. Now, why did I put weed management first? If I have weeds in my pasture and I'm going to improve soil fertility, how much of that N, P, and K do you think is going to go to the weeds? Right, it's going to go quite a bit. If you've got 20 or 30% weed pressure in the field, I'm guessing it's going to be 20 to 30% of your nutrients go towards those weeds. What about species selection? If I am trying to put in a new forage variety and I've got 25 to 30% of my total area in a particular species, how successful am I going to be in establishing a new forage variety? Probably not very successful. It's a competition over real estate. And then we get into grazing management. To me, this is one of the things that we have a lot of control over, but we still don't have a good number of our producers actually doing to help control yield. Now, to me, today, I'm just going to talk about three of these. I'm going to talk about weed management, of course. I'm going to talk about soil fertility, and I'm going to talk a little bit about grazing management. I'm not going to get into species selection as much. So let's look at the effects of weeds on forage yield. Why do we... Folks, there's two reasons why a cow jumps a fence. All right? She's either hungry or she's in heat. And I've seen it in both cases. But we look at weed control in a pasture. Decreasing the carrying capacity is one of our biggest concerns about weeds in a pasture. A pretty good rule of thumb, and this tends to hold true, is that for every pound of weeds that we remove, we probably do get about a pound of forage back. Now, let me throw in a little clause here. You take something like bull thistle. Now, bull thistle may offset, or thistle in general may offset a pound of forage yield, but how much forage utilization is actually taken up by that bull thistle is another question. It may be 2 or 3 times more that because a cow doesn't want to get next to a bull thistle, doesn't want to get their nose poked. So pound for pound, but there's also some utilization there that's also an issue. We also affect the quality, the quantity, and the stand longevity of our forage stands. And stand longevity is one of my biggest concerns because as a pasture becomes more and more weedy, animals are forced to go back and graze these areas that are less weedy, and they end up putting more grazing pressure on these particular patches, and we start inviting more and more weeds into those particular areas. Some weeds are just more aggressive than the forage species that we have out there. If you've ever seen common ragweed up to your chest in the middle of summer, you know what I'm talking about. Same way with spiny amaranth. We also reduce our grazable area, which I've already talked about, and we also slow and reduce forage intake. Now, I can't prove this one, but I'm willing to bet that a cow is much happier in a field full of stand full of forage without weeds because they're not having to hunt around and look for a grazing station. So I'm going to say that the process of looking for that grazing station is probably takes puts a little more time constraint on the cow to find their forage or meet their forage needs. So this is, I think this is a study actually done in South America. Is that right, Byron? This is one of your old slides. But this is looking at forage response to weed control. And over here on the left-hand side, this is where we had good weed controls. We had 5.5 tons per acre of forage at about 1.1 animal units per acre. We look on the other side, on the untreated side of the pasture, this is where we didn't have weed control, had 2.3 tons per acre and a half an animal unit per acre. That's pretty impressive to me. Now, of course, it's going to all depend on the amount of weed pressure that you have, but most of the pastures that I'm on in any given year, I see this, all right? I'm seeing 20, 30, 40. I've seen 70 to 80% of pastures taken up by weeds, but they actually increased their animal units per acre by 2.3 times just by controlling weeds in this particular field. Now, what's the forage? Weed control, we get a lot of bang for our buck on yield on weed control. But when we combine weed control with fertility, that's where we really start making our money on yield. And we look here, this is a control. This was actually in Bermuda grass. And looking at the yield, just a little over 1,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. But the weeds make it up a pretty big portion of this, okay? Now, they went through and they put in 5 different treatments. One, they went in and mowed, which is what the most of us do. They used mowing and fertility, just straight fertilizer, herbicide, and herbicide and fertility. What I want to point out is mowing did give them some weed control, and it did improve their yield. Fertilizer alone, it shifted the advantage towards the weeds, right? But when we get out here and looking at herbicide, herbicide alone got the yield up about the same as we did with mowing and fertility. And then herbicide and fertility shot yields up to over 8,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. So there is a benefit in terms of yield of combining our weed control with our herbicide. Now, why don't we just mow for control? This is something that has frustrated me since the day I walked through the door in Dow. Is trying to convince people that it's better to control weeds with herbicides cheaper than it is to go out and mow. But right now, estimates from most universities, the lowest I've seen is about $15 an acre right now when you factor in labor and fuel costs. And that goes up to about $25 an acre per mowing. Now, that's a single mowing, and that's the equivalent. I can get you a really good herbicide treatment for $15 an acre. I can get you a dang good herbicide treatment for $22 an acre. That's only going to give us temporary results, though, mowing once, all right? It's going to take 2 to 3 timely mowings, and we're still not going to get complete control of weeds. Goldenrod and tall ironweed was in a study that they had at the University of Missouri, and it took them 3 years to get 80% control of that. 3 years, 2 to 3 timely mowings a year, probably at a cost of somewhere between $100 and $150 an acre. I can do it for 15, folks. The other thing is, and this is the big one, when we go out and mow, a lot of times we're removing grazable forage. We're getting rid of yield by taking that mower through the field. And to me, that's one of the biggest issues and the biggest, pull downs on the potential yield of a field. This is another study. This was done at Virginia Tech, and my good friend Pat Birch was actually involved in this. And they went in and they controlled horse nettle, and then they looked at utilization. So over here, this is one of our particular products, Forefront. And they looked at it at 3 different work rates, and what they found is they got 93%, that's the green bar here, 93% control of the horse nettle. And when they did that, they had about 80% utilization of the forage in that particular field. Now you get over here where you have 2,4-D ester, Cimarron, or just untreated where we didn't have any control. Look at the difference, 23.8% control of the horse nettle. 58.8% control and 0%. But look at the amount of utilization. So just by removing those that weed species, we increased yield in that field. We gave that animal more forage to utilize. So that was a big benefit to controlling horse nettle. And I've seen some places in Georgia, folks, where horse nettle is pretty much the only forage out in the field. And that was especially true this year. Now, what is the value of controlling weeds? I get this question a lot, is when do I know I need to go out and control weeds? All right, this is Scott Flynn. Nobody else. This is not Dow AgriScience that put this together, so don't blame them, blame me. But I started looking at it, and I said, okay, I need to make some assumptions if I want to calculate what is the value of controlling weeds. One, I'm going to assume that every pound of weeds that I remove, I'm going to gain a pound of forage. I'm also going to assume that forage out there, for every 10 pounds of dry matter that I have, I'm thinking I'm going to get a pound of gain. So this is more kind of geared towards a stocking system or stocker operation. The herbicide application I'm going to assume is about $22. Okay, I'm going after trees, not just broadleaves and that. So this is kind of worst case scenario. And I'm going to assume that I'm not going to apply a herbicide more than once every 3 to 4 years. All right, I'm going to use good grazing management, and I don't want to have to apply that herbicide every year. So I came in and I said, okay, let's look at the profit per pound of beef. With these assumptions, say I'm making $1 per pound. All right, depending on if you're an economist or a farmer, you might say I'm making $1 a pound. If we look at the level of productivity, say we're producing, these is 3,000 pounds of dry matter, 6,000 pounds of dry matter, and 9,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. These numbers here represent the percentage of weeds that would have to be in that field before I could justify spending the money on herbicide. Now, how do I get this? Well, if I'm assuming 1 pound of forage removed, or 1 pound of weeds removed gives me 1 pound of gain, then if I add at 30% utilization in a continuous grazing system, if I remove 222 pounds of weeds and get 222 pounds of forage, then I have the potential to increase my stocking rate on an acre basis and make up for that. All right, so that's kind of the break even. I can increase my stocking rate by the forage that I've actually added there. So that's how I came up with these numbers. Now, these numbers seem kind of low, right? 7%. All the way down to 1%. I mean, heck, if you even see a weed in the field, a lot of times you're probably talking about a minimum of 5 to 10%. So in this particular scenario, where profit is about $1 per pound, you can see that weed control, it pays to control weeds even at low rates. Now, if I look at it like an economist, and I go through and I look at my return on investment and the time I put into it, I might be looking at about $0.25 a pound. All right, I'm using an economic model here from Iowa State University. I apply that $0.25 a pound to it, and I say, okay, if I'm only making $0.25 a pound per pound of beef that I'm selling at these particular production rates, then I'm looking probably in a continuous grazing system, worst case scenario, about 30% weed control, and I'm going to have to go in and actually clean up the weeds. But as we go to the right here on these graphs, we got to go from continuous to rotational to strip grazing. We're actually talking about anywhere from 5 to 10% of the weeds. We can start justifying actually spraying those out because we can increase our stocking rates. So that's where I'm coming from as far as the value of weed control. Now we get into talking about soil fertility and yield, and this is where I get nervous because I know there's folks in here that know this hands down better than I do. This is a study that I think Gary, you and Don and Carl Hovland actually put together, right? But looking at soil tests across the southern U.S., and we look, and of the 10 southern states that they did this in, number of soils tested anywhere from 5 to 50% was the range of responses, an average of 21%. Pastures with pH below 6, about 52%. Low in phosphorus, 46%. Low in potassium, 33%. Annual fertilized pastures that are actually fertilized, only 28%. And annual fertilized of hay ground, roughly 66%. You know what this tells me? That yield in the South, and let me tell you, I'm in the Midwest, and it's the same there too. We just don't have the data to prove it. It's suppressed because of our lack of concern on soil fertility. We look at the role of N, P, and K in a plant. Nitrogen is essential for photosynthesis. It makes up 16% of the plant protein by weight. Potassium is important for us for nitrogen uptake purposes, water relations, disease resistance, starch synthesis, so the energy in that plant. Phosphorus is very important for harvesting light energy, root formation, and seedling development. And yet most producers will never take the time. Well, I'm not categorizing. If you're here, I'm thinking you're probably a pretty doggone good producer, but a lot of producers I deal with would not take the time to even look at this. Matter of fact, I had a producer tell me one time that I was the only person that had ever told him that soil pH was important in pasture grasses. if you can believe that. Also, let's look at the nutrient removal by forages. So we're thinking about maximizing yield. We also have to take into account what's being removed by those particular forages. So we look here in the case of the grasses, which is probably what we're supplying. For every ton of Bermuda grass, orchard grass, or tall fescue, we're removing anywhere from 35 to 50 pounds of nitrogen. That probably needs to be replaced if we just at least want to maintain that level of production. With alfalfa and red clover, you can see that's mostly coming from atmospheric nitrogen, but those levels of P and K are where we really focus on fertility with legumes. But what I want you to take from this is that every time we go in and harvest hay or we're grazing off that, we're not getting all that back on the land. And we have to increase our soil fertility in order to at least maintain yield or to increase yield. Now, fertility is also important for plant health, and this relates directly to yield. We look at cool season grasses, and we usually start out with cool season grasses. We're usually the strongest in the spring in terms of root mass. And what happens is as we progress through the summer, as we continue to graze that, we tend to lose more and more root mass, especially if we're grazing it extremely hard. And then what we hope for is that in the fall of the year, we get into cooler temperatures and we increase the root mass. So soil fertility plays a big part, especially when it comes to fall fertility and the growth and development of these perennial grasses, not only below ground, but also above ground. We look at the tiller, what the animals are grazing. It lasts for about a year. Once it puts on a seed head, it's pretty much, we get to the end of the season, that's the end of its life. We need to put on a new tiller. So what happens is in about July, August, during the year, we have this, this increase in new tiller development as our old tillers started to pass on or who have mortality. And it's extremely important for us in stands that are thinning to have that fall application of nitrogen for the strength and the longevity of that particular stand. So extremely important from a yield standpoint to pay attention to these. Now, nitrogen applications, they're usually best in split applications. What we want to do is nitrogen leaches out of the soil, so we don't want to go out and put 200 pounds of nitrogen on a pasture, or 150 pounds of nitrogen on a pasture at one time. We're going to lose a lot of it. So we actually put it out there in split applications, one to spread that out over the season so we don't lose as much, but also to maximize yield over the season. Stockpiling tall fescue, we're looking at 40 to 80 pounds of nitrogen early in August to maximize our yield on stockpiled tall fescue. And you can look at your local extension publications to see what they recommend, but this is kind of the range that I came up with when doing the research. Legumes, if we've got 30% or more legumes in the pasture, and we're going to assume you have good soil fertility, you don't really need nitrogen. Once we start getting down there below or around 25, 20, we might need a little nitrogen if we are looking to maximize yield. All right, a lot of people probably still won't do that, but if we want to maximize yield, we would still have to add nitrogen to those systems when we get down less than 25% legumes. Phosphorus, single applications usually needed annually for phosphorus. Maybe even a single application that would go for 2 or 3 years. It's not very mobile in the soil. If we don't use it this year, usually it's around the next year. Potassium is usually needed annually. It is removed in large amounts in the soil. So especially in haying systems, we need to be very, very cognizant of our potassium levels. But also, potassium is a little more mobile in the soil, so it does leach out. And then other micronutrients, I'm just going to suggest you do a soil test, you work with your extension agent to actually figure out what you need in terms of those other nutrients. So soil acidity, this is another big issue, but we have to be concerned about soil acidity from a nitrogen fixation standpoint. One, it lowers the number of rhizobia, the bacteria that infect that root hair, that actually are helping us to capture that atmospheric nitrogen. The other thing, it's going to limit the attachment to infectable root hairs, and it also affects the availability of certain nutrients which are very, very important for nitrogen fixation, like molybdenum, sulfur, and phosphorus. Other things, it lowers the CEC. It increases the level of toxic metals in our pastures, which could suppress yield. And the other thing it does is soil organism activity. Earthworms in particular, their activity or their presence is much less when we get into acidic soils. So Marvin already showed this. I'm not going to go through, but it kind of gives you the tolerance of certain forages to pH. And then the last thing I want to touch on is the application of lime. We need to plan ahead when it comes to lime. You need probably at least 6 months prior to a particular growing season to start correcting your lime application. It's going to take at least 6 months to do that. Better to till it in, but on surface applications we may be looking at months to even a year. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to hit that last slide, so I'll be happy to take any questions that you have. At least I'll try to answer. Yes, sir.
You've got a weed control chemical that we can spray on pasture that won't kill clover?
Boy,
Y'all heard that in the back, didn't you?
No.
I've never heard that question before.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Because, hey, we get a good stand of clover out there, and then we spray graze on next, and there goes our clover.
Right, and you know the relation or the similarities between most of our clovers and our broadleaves are so close that that's an extremely tall order to fill.
Get it, we'll buy a lot of it.
Yeah, I'm sure about that, but it's yeah, it's an issue that we're aware of, but it's a hard concept for us to fulfill.
One more question, yes.
What's your opinion on using wicks in pastures to, is it economical enough that you can get enough weed kill using wicks or wipers so that you won't kill your clover in pastures?
Yeah, with certain
Go on and spray it, kill it, and then put the clover back in.
right with certain species, I think yeah, a wick is a good option to use. A good wick. A lot of these wicks will still drip herbicide onto the field, and if you're using residual herbicide, that will still kill your clover, but you know, choosing the right wick and the right herbicide, yeah, it is a good.
Okay, let's give Scott a very big round of applause. He did a great job.